In 1998, a retired pathologist named Eugene Foster mailed a set of blood samples to a genetics lab in England. He wasn't investigating a crime. He was investigating a rumor, one that was already 196 years old. The rumor was this: that Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote "All men are created equal," had fathered children with a woman he legally owned. For nearly 2 centuries, Jefferson's white descendants had denied it. Historians had argued about it in journals and biographies without ever settling it, and the only people who had consistently said it was true were the descendants of an enslaved woman named Sally Hemings, dismissed generation after generation because in the world that controlled the historical record, their word didn't count as evidence. What the blood samples eventually revealed didn't just settle a paternity question 200 years old. It forced a national museum, a research foundation, and a wide swath of American textbooks to rewrite what they had spent decades saying about one of the men who built the country. This is the story of how that happened, and just as importantly, how close it came to not happening at all. The accusation first became public in September of 1802, in the middle of Jefferson's first term as president. It was published by a journalist named James Callender, a man with a complicated motive. Jefferson had once quietly paid him to attack political rivals in print, the way presidential campaigns still hire people to do today. When Jefferson later declined to reward him with a political appointment, Callender turned on his former patron and printed the accusation that Jefferson kept an enslaved woman named Sally Hemings as what he called a concubine, and that her eldest son bore a striking resemblance to the president. Other newspapers picked it up. Jefferson never issued a public denial. His family did it for him for generations, insisting the story was Federalist slander from a discredited scandalmonger, which, to be fair, Callender partly was. But being an unreliable messenger doesn't automatically make a message false, and inside the Hemings family, a different, far more detailed account survived, passed down as oral history, insisting on a truth the official record refused to print. To understand why that oral history was dismissed for so long, you have to understand who was telling it and who was listening. Sally Hemings was enslaved. Her children were born enslaved. After emancipation, the family that had once owned them remained wealthy, literate, and politically connected. The kind of family whose version of events got published, cited, and taught in schools. The Hemings descendants, meanwhile, were black, in an America that spent the better part of 2 centuries building legal and social systems specifically designed to discount black testimony. Their story wasn't dismissed because it lacked internal consistency. It was dismissed because the people who controlled the archives, the monuments, and the textbooks had no institutional incentive to believe it, and every reason not to. There's a detail in Sally Hemings' own ancestry that makes the whole story stranger, and it rarely makes it into the popular version. Her father was a Virginia planter named John Wales, who was also the father of Jefferson's late wife, Martha. That means Sally Hemings was Martha Jefferson's half-sister, enslaved by her own brother-in-law, inherited by Jefferson as property along with more than 100 other enslaved people when he married Martha in 1774. The 2 women reportedly bore a physical resemblance to each other. Whatever else this story is, it is not a simple one, and it was never going to fit comfortably into the story Americans wanted to tell about their third president. The story that survived inside the family was specific enough to be checked against the historical record, which is exactly what eventually made it testable. According to Sally's son Madison, who gave a detailed account of his mother's life to an Ohio newspaper reporter in 1873, the relationship began in Paris. Jefferson served there as America's minister to France from 1784 to 1789, and Sally, 14 years old when she arrived, sent to accompany Jefferson's younger daughter as a lady's maid, lived in Jefferson's residence, the Hôtel de Langeac, for 2 years. She spent those years effectively free, since French law did not recognize slavery on French soil, and she learned the language and earned her own wages. By her son's later account, she became pregnant by Jefferson in Paris, and when it came time to return to Virginia, initially refused. What happened next is one of the most striking, least discussed details in the entire story. A 16-year-old enslaved girl had genuine leverage over one of the most powerful men in the young United States, and by every surviving account, she used it. Pursuing her freedom through a French court was a real option, but not an easy one. She was likely illiterate, owned no property, and was already pregnant, which would have made surviving alone in France nearly impossible. So she negotiated instead, from inside a relationship with almost no formal power on her side. She told Jefferson she would return to Virginia only if he promised her, in her son's later account, extraordinary privileges, including a solemn pledge that any children they had together would be freed once they turned 21. Jefferson agreed. 4 of their 6 children survived to adulthood, and all 4 were, in fact, freed at or near their 21st birthdays. Exactly as promised. That detail matters for reasons beyond biography. It's one of the earliest and strangest pieces of circumstantial evidence historians had, because the pattern doesn't fit anything else at Monticello. Jefferson freed no other enslaved family there as a unit, and no other enslaved person on the plantation gained freedom before the age of 31, with a single exception, a man who simply ran away. If Sally Hemings's children were ordinary plantation labor like everyone else's, that pattern makes no sense. If they were Jefferson's own children, freed on a schedule matching a promise made a decade or more earlier in Paris, it makes a great deal of sense. There was more, and it came from Jefferson's own hand. He kept meticulous farm records at Monticello, logging who was present and who was traveling, month by month for years. Sally Hemings's pregnancies lined up one after another with the windows when Jefferson himself was documented at Monticello, and she did not conceive during the stretches when the records placed him elsewhere. That alone isn't proof. Other men lived and worked at Monticello too, but paired with everything else, the Paris negotiation, the freedom granted at 21, Madison Hemings' later testimony, it narrowed the field considerably for anyone willing to look at it honestly. None of this was nothing, but none of it was proof either. And that's precisely why the debate survived for 200 years without resolving. Circumstantial evidence convinces some people and not others. It always has. A cluster of coincidences that looks damning to one historian looks like innuendo to another, especially when the accused is a founding father and the accuser's family has no power to force the question. Jefferson's own descendants maintained a competing story, that the real father was one of Jefferson's nephews, Peter or Samuel Carr, sons of his sister, and for most of the 20th century, that counterstory was the one most textbooks repeated, partly because it was the version Jefferson's own family had been telling since the 19th century, with all the credibility that came from being white, literate, and connected to the man himself, and partly because it was the version that let the author of the Declaration of Independence off the hook. By the 1990s, a shift was already underway in how historians weighed all of this. In 1997, the historian Annette Gordon-Reed published a book systematically re-examining the documentary record, comparing what evidence actually existed against the Carr theory versus the Hemings family's own account, and concluding that historians had been far too quick to dismiss the oral history and far too generous toward the version that protected Jefferson's reputation. Her work argued for treating the Hemings family's testimony as evidence in its own right, worth weighing on its merits, rather than folklore to be politely explained away. It reopened the argument in serious academic circles the year before. Science offered a way to test it directly. Here's the part. Most retellings get wrong. Scientists in 1998 did not have Thomas Jefferson's own DNA to work with. He had no surviving sons, so there was no direct male line descendant anyone could sample. What Eugene Foster's team had instead was a workaround, and understanding it is the key to understanding everything the study could and couldn't actually prove. The Y chromosome passes from father to son almost unchanged across generations, with only rare mutations accumulating along the way. That means a man alive today can carry a genetic signature nearly identical to a male ancestor from 10 or more generations back, as long as the unbroken line of fathers and sons was never interrupted by an unrecorded outside pregnancy. So Foster's team didn't need Jefferson himself. They needed men who shared his Y chromosome by inheritance, descendants of Field Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's paternal uncle, who would carry the same male line genetic signature Thomas Jefferson had inherited from their shared grandfather. The specific markers Foster's team measured were short, repeating sequences of DNA called microsatellites, plus a handful of other genetic markers passed down the male line, 19 in total. Each marker mutates slowly and predictably at a known rate over generations. Two unrelated men picked at random would be expected to differ at several of these markers. Two men who share a male line ancestor within the last 2 or 3 centuries would be expected to match almost perfectly, with maybe one marker drifting by a single unit due to a random mutation somewhere along the chain. That's the signature the lab was hunting for. Not a fingerprint unique to one individual, but a family signature, specific enough that finding it in 2 supposedly unrelated men, in the right historical context, would be difficult to explain any other way. Against that Jefferson line signature, the team tested 3 other lines, representing every serious competing explanation that had circulated for a century and a half. And it's worth being precise about what each one represented, because the story only makes sense if the names stay straight. The first was the male line descendants of Eston Hemings, Sally's youngest son, the line whose family had preserved generation after generation the specific claim that Thomas Jefferson himself was their ancestor. This was the Hemings family's own explanation. The second was descendants of Peter and Samuel Carr, the nephews Jefferson's own grandchildren had long insisted were the real fathers. This was the establishment's explanation, the one that protected Jefferson, promoted by his own descendants. The third was descendants of Thomas Woodson, a man whose family carried its own separate long-standing oral tradition claiming descent from Jefferson and Hemings. not a rival theory about who fathered Sally's children, but a competing claim about which child came first, made by an entirely different family convinced with equal sincerity that they too descended from the third president. In total, the study compared 19 genetic markers across 14 living men. The results, published in the journal Nature on November 5, 1998, split cleanly, and the direction each line split and surprised different people for very different reasons. The field. Jefferson descendants and the Eston-Hemmings descendants shared an identical Y chromosome haplotype. The Carr descendants matched neither line, directly contradicting the explanation Jefferson's own grandchildren had repeated for generations. A Jefferson man, the data said, had fathered Eston-Hemmings. The family that had been believed for 200 years turned out to be wrong. The family that had been dismissed for 200 years turned out to be right. Then came the third result, and it complicates any tidy version of this story in a way worth sitting with. The Woodson line showed no genetic match to the Jefferson signature at all, and their male line ancestry traced to a different European source entirely, despite an oral tradition inside that family that was, if anything, even more specific and consistently held than the Hemmings family's own account. In the 1970s, Woodson descendants who had lost contact with one another over generations reconnected and discovered, independently, that their separate branches told nearly identical versions of the family history, all of them insisting Thomas Woodson was Sally Hemmings's first son, born shortly after her return from Paris, and Jefferson's child. Monticello's own later research committee, reviewing everything years afterward, called it a compelling oral tradition that almost certainly dates to Woodson's lifetime, and concluded the DNA still ruled it out. Some Woodson family members rejected the finding on ethical grounds, arguing the study's handling had been mishandled by outside parties, but the genetic result itself was unambiguous. No match to anyone in the Jefferson line. That's the detail worth pausing on, because it cuts against the tidy moral that the oral history was finally vindicated. It wasn't, not uniformly, and a documentary that pretends otherwise isn't being honest with its audience. One family's oral tradition, the Hemmings families, turned out to be consistent with the hard science. Another family's oral tradition, just as sincerely held, just as carefully passed down across generations who'd never met each other, arrived at independently and found to match almost word for word, did not hold up. DNA isn't a machine for confirming whichever story feels most sympathetic or most poetic. It's a machine for finding out what's true. And sometimes what's true disappoints people who had every reason and every apparent piece of evidence to believe otherwise. So the Eston-Hemmings result stood on its own, and it was real. But it was also narrower than the newspaper headlines that ran with it. Roughly 25 adult men carrying that same Jefferson Y chromosome signature were alive in Virginia at the time Eston was conceived, and a handful of them are known to have visited Monticello. The test could identify the Jefferson male line as a whole. It could not, on its own, distinguish Thomas Jefferson individually from any other man who happened to share his family's Y chromosome. Critics inside the scientific community noticed immediately, and they said so in print, in the same journal that published the original finding. Within weeks, Letters to Nature pointed out that the paper's own title, Jefferson Fathered Slave's Last Child, claimed more certainty than the underlying data actually supported, since the study never calculated how many other men carrying the Jefferson signature might fit the same profile. One geneticist raised a more specific and more damaging point. Thomas Jefferson had a younger brother, Randolph, who lived nearby with 5 sons of his own, every one of whom would have carried the identical Y chromosome signature, and none of whom the study had tested or formally ruled out. That gap in the evidence is real, and it hasn't fully closed even today. A petition seeking further evidentiary review of the paternity question, including these alternate theories, remains active as of recent years. So what closed that gap enough for historians and eventually institutions to treat the question as effectively settled, not the lab result by itself? It was the lab result added to everything else. The documented visitation patterns matching every pregnancy, the freedom granted at 21 exactly as promised, Madison Hemmings' direct and detailed testimony, and the simple fact that Randolph Jefferson, unlike his brother, left behind no comparable body of circumstantial evidence placing him at Monticello during the relevant conception windows. Foster's own team, weighing the genetic evidence against the full historical record, concluded that the simplest and most probable explanation remained that Thomas Jefferson himself, not some more obscure relative, had fathered Eston-Hemmings. Scientists don't reach for the word probable lightly, especially not after a peer review process that had already drawn public criticism. But in a 200-year-old paternity question with no living witnesses and no confession on record, probable, backed by genetics, timing, and testimony all pointing the same direction at once, was the strongest conclusion anyone was realistically going to get. And crucially, It was the exact conclusion the Hemmings family had been offering quietly and consistently for 6 generations. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which operates Monticello, didn't accept the finding overnight. It formed a research committee of 9 staff members, 4 of them with doctorates, to independently weigh the DNA results alongside the documentary and oral history record. In January of 2000, that committee concluded there was a high probability Jefferson had fathered not just Eston, but all 6 of Sally Hemings' children recorded in the Monticello farm books. Nearly 2 decades later, in 2018, the Foundation went further still, formally affirming the relationship's existence and citing more than 3 decades of overlap between Jefferson's documented locations and Hemings' conception windows across all 6 pregnancies, though it deliberately stopped short of calling the relationship a love affair or describing it as consensual, given the basic and inescapable fact that Sally Hemings was, throughout it, a woman Jefferson legally owned and could have sold at any moment. That institutional shift is arguably the real headline of this entire story, bigger than the lab result itself. For most of the 20th century, Monticello presented the relationship to visitors as an unproven and faintly scandalous rumor, something respectable historians didn't quite endorse, and tour guides mentioned only in passing, if at all. The physical space told the same story the official history did. The room believed to have been Sally Hemings' own living quarters, in the south wing of the mansion, had at one point been converted into a men's restroom for visiting tourists, a fact that later struck even Monticello's own staff as a kind of accidental, unintentional statement about how little the estate had prioritized her story. That began to change through a restoration effort called the Mountaintop Project, a multi-year, $35 million undertaking that used archaeology to physically rebuild the world Jefferson's enslaved community had lived in. Archaeologists excavated along Mulberry Row, the plantation's working spine, and rebuilt structures including the Hemings family's cabin. In February of 2017, the restroom in the south wing was gutted, and beneath decades of renovation, workers found the original early 19th century brick hearth, fireplace, and flooring, the physical remains of the room where Sally Hemings most likely lived with her children. On June 16, 2018, Monticello reopened that space as a permanent exhibit dedicated to her life and invited her descendants back to the mountain for the unveiling. Hundreds came. Some were descended from Madison Hemings' line, which had preserved the story faithfully for 6 generations. Some were descended from lines that had lived as white for most of that same span. That day, for the first time, many of them stood in the same room together, in a space that had spent years as a public restroom before it became, finally, hers. Not every branch of the family made that same journey back. And that detail belongs in this story because it says something honest about how differently people carry the same buried truth. Eston Hemings' own line, after settling in the Midwest, chose to live as white, and largely stopped acknowledging Sally Hemings or their black ancestry at all, even while quietly preserving a family tradition that they were somehow distantly related to the Jeffersons. 2 branches of one family carrying 2 different survival strategies for the same dangerous secret. One side kept the whole story and was disbelieved for 2 centuries. The other side kept a fragment of it and stayed safe by staying quiet about the rest. The DNA, when it finally arrived, reconnected both of those threads back to the same root, whether every descendant wanted that reconnection or not. It's also worth placing Jefferson's case in a wider frame, because he wasn't the only founding-era figure whose relationship to slavery has been re-examined through hard evidence rather than inherited reputation. George Washington enslaved more than 300 people at Mount Vernon, and unlike Jefferson, arranged in his will for all of the ones he personally owned to be freed after his wife's death. A fact often presented uncritically as moral distinction, though it says nothing about the decades those people spent enslaved beforehand. James Madison, the chief architect of the Constitution, enslaved more than 100 people at Montpelier and freed none of them, not even in his will. None of these men have had a Jefferson-style DNA reckoning, mostly because none left behind a specific, testable, generations-old paternity claim the way Jefferson did. But the pattern underneath all of it is the same. Founding-era wealth, founding-era power, and founding-era rhetoric about liberty were built directly on top of slavery. And for most of American history, the institutions that told these men's stories had every reason to leave that part out or soften it into a footnote. Jefferson's case simply happens to be the one where a living family kept the receipt long enough, and specifically enough for science to eventually check it. The ripple effects went beyond one family and one estate. The genetic method that resolved the Jefferson-Hemings question, finding a living male line relative to stand in for a historical figure who left no direct DNA behind, became a template used far beyond Monticello. Genetic genealogists have since applied the same Y chromosome technique to other contested lineages from the colonial and founding era. Disputed claims of descent from European royalty carried by American families for generations, disputed paternity claims involving other prominent men of the period, family legends that had survived word of mouth for 200 years, with no way to check them against anything but each other. The tool built to answer one specific 200-year-old rumor became standard equipment for testing all the others still floating around American genealogy. It's worth being precise at the end of all this about what actually happened here, because the true version is more interesting than the exaggerated one that tends to circulate online. No lab ever compared the Founding Fathers, as a group, against modern Americans, as a group, and rewrote American history in a single dramatic afternoon. That's not what a Y chromosome test can even do, and no credible scientist has ever claimed otherwise. What actually happened was slower, narrower, and far more human. One family kept telling the truth about their own origins for 6 generations, against every institutional incentive in the country to stop. And in 1998, a molecule that has no stake whatsoever in anyone's reputation finally backed them up. That's the fact worth ending on, because it's the one this whole story keeps circling back to, and it deserves to be said plainly rather than gently. The DNA did not discover a new fact. Madison Hemmings had stated the fact, on the record by name, in a newspaper interview in 1873. His descendants repeated it at every kitchen table, every family gathering, every rite of passage for 125 years afterward, and were dismissed at every turn as unreliable, biased, or simply wrong. What the DNA changed was never the truth. What it changed was who was finally willing to listen to it, and what it cost the country nothing to admit. Once a laboratory said it first, instead of a black family that had been saying it unrewarded the entire time. The men who wrote, "All men are created equal," left behind more than documents, more than a nation, more than the words themselves. Some of them left behind children the country spent 2 centuries refusing to acknowledge, in rooms that were eventually converted into restrooms rather than remembered, until their own cells, indifferent to reputation, immune to 200 years of denial, and utterly unconcerned with anyone's comfort, settled the argument their descendants had been making patiently and correctly all along. That's not a twist ending. That's just what the truth looks like once enough people with enough power finally agree to check.